So Becki, set the stage for us. So what do you expect from the General Assembly, and what will you be working on with your team as those lawmakers come back into session?
Thanks, Donna. And first, before we get into that, let me just thank you for the great work that you do putting these Shaftesbury events together. I think you've done an incredible job of transitioning from the COVID pandemic world of Zoom into what we have. And so thank you for the great work you do. I know you've got thank you for inviting us today to talk about the North Carolina General Assembly and what's coming up. And I know you've got some great programming ahead of us. So first of all, as we begin this new year, a new Locke Foundation and a new legislative outreach group that we'll be working with, I just want to take a minute and thank you for everything you are doing and have done. And I very much look forward to the programming coming up over the next several months. But getting back to today's, and again, thank you so much for the invitation. We are very excited. We are ready. We've been working very hard, really since the election, on getting things queued up. Those who are familiar with our work at the John Locke Foundation and Civitas, now under one banner, know what our legislative priorities are going to be, basically because this has been consistent for 30 years of the John Locke Foundation and 15 years of Civitas. So what we're going to be looking at is limited government, personal responsibility, low taxes, fiscal responsibility, a focus on education that focuses on kids rather than bureaucracies. We're going to be looking at fewer regulations. We're going to be looking for greater access to health care at a reasonable cost, and all of the things in between with that. But Donna, as we start this new year, and as we come out of a pretty contentious election cycle, I think nobody will disagree with that. We're now ready to govern in North Carolina, and that will begin when the General Assembly goes into session for the next 2 years. It will begin on Wednesday when they gavel in with Senator Berger in the Senate and Tim Moore in the House. Now, one of the first things both bodies is going to have to do is to elect that leadership in the House and the Senate. So Tim Moore is the presumptive Speaker of the House. Phil Berger is the presumptive President of the Senate. Getting things in line, getting committees lined up, getting rooms assigned. On Wednesday, what we expect is a pretty ceremonial day when all of the members will be officially sworn in. They will put their hand on a Bible. They will swear to uphold the Constitution of the state of North Carolina, which, by the way, I believe the Locke Foundation is the only organization in the state that does have copies of the state Constitution. We will be distributing those to every member of the General Assembly so that they have it handy to make notes and make notes in the margin and highlight things. When they're asked to uphold that Constitution, we want to make sure that they have that literally in their hand. So again, Wednesday will be mainly ceremonial. We're seeing committees being assigned. We're seeing there's a lot of hubbub down at the building with members moving into their offices. Some are changing offices. Some are getting their offices all lined up. Then that we expect them to adjourn until Wednesday, January 27th, when they'll come back to get underway and into work in earnest. So we'll have a little bit of a break while everybody gets their feet firmly planted, and some more committee assignments and those kind of things are what we're expecting. Now, as far as what the General Assembly is going to do and what we can expect moving forward, Donna, our team has been meeting with legislators and getting their feel, taking temperature of where the opportunities are for many of the Locke Foundation policies. And one of the things that's become clear to me in those conversations is I think we can look at 3 different phases of this General Assembly, if you will. And the first phase will be dealing with COVID. And that's everything from, I expect them to look at the Emergency Management Act, under which the governor has been issuing these executive orders and restricting businesses and closing businesses down since last March. A lot of concern about the overreaching authority that is in place under the current Emergency Management Act. So we may see, I expect that we'll see some proposals to change that. And one of the things that I would urge lawmakers to look at when they do that is not to do that under the lens of a Republican-led General Assembly and a Democrat, Roy Cooper, sitting in the governor's office, but to look at what good government looks like, no matter who is sitting in the governor's office, and the kind of authority and power that we really want vested in that office, no matter who sits in that office. Some of the other things they'll be looking at initially, I believe, is the distribution of some of the federal COVID money. Of course, the vaccine rollout and the many challenges, and in some cases sort of the fiasco that has become. So the first part of the session I anticipate will be mostly about COVID. And lots of different pieces in there. Don't forget that the main thing that the General Assembly does every year is that they pass or try to pass a 2-year budget. Now, with Roy Cooper's vetoes last couple of years, we have not been able to do that. But I think that they will, I'm going to make a prediction here. I think they will pass a budget, but we're going to at least go through that budget process with looking at the forecasting, looking at the revenue. This is going to be a little bit tricky, again, because of the impact of COVID and the shutdown of business, and what is the revenue going to look like, and what are the challenges that the state is going to face. So we'll be watching that budget process and the details of that. And although the budget technically is not supposed to have policy in it, there's a lot of policy associated with where someone decides to spend money. For example, if you were to open your checkbook and let us look through that, we could tell a lot about what your priorities and your principles are by the way that you spend your money. So it's the same thing with the North Carolina state budget. We'll be looking at that. And then the third phase of the General Assembly, I think, is going to be taken up with redistricting. Just a reminder, with everything going on and all of the other issues and everything we've been dealing with the pandemic and other challenges that have taken up so much of our time, don't forget that the U.S. Census is being taken, as it is every 10 years. Those numbers will be released, and North Carolina will get those numbers of how many congressional districts that we will have. Many people are saying we'll have an additional congressional district. So that's going to change that congressional map from 13 districts that we have now to possibly 14. So we'll be seeing a lot of changes there. And then the other thing that the General Assembly does is they apportion and redistrict the North Carolina Senate with 50 seats and the North Carolina House of Representatives with 120 seats. So that is also going to take up a lot of time and a lot of energy during this legislative session. Now, quick reminder too, the governor in North Carolina has no veto power over redistricting. So that could lead for some interesting dynamics there. We also saw one of the things that the Locke Foundation has advocated for years is in all phases of government is a transparent process. And I think if we look back to the last redistricting that we saw in the North Carolina General Assembly just a year or so ago, that transparent process that they literally had cameras in the room where the redistricting was taking place. So I think there's been some good precedent, some good ideas that have been set forth before that we may very, very well see again. So in a nutshell, that's where I see the session overall going. But there's, as always, the devil is in the details.
And speaking of the details, Leah and Jordan, Becki really set the stage well. COVID, budget, and redistricting. So Jordan, let's start with you. You're going to be working on healthcare policy, a regulatory policy. Where do you see some action or some activity that you're anticipating this session, particularly when we get into the issue of good government, which of course is what the John Locke Foundation is all about? Help us understand.
Yeah. Thanks. I just got to start off by saying, I'm very optimistic and hopeful about this session. And the main reason being, I came from the research division at John Locke, and now I'm over here on the government affairs team. So I'm going from writing about the policy to, discussing the policy with stakeholders. And, when I think about what's in front of us this year, we've seen so much devastation and so much heartbreak that has come from the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the General Assembly Assembly has a real opportunity this year to, go through with some of these reforms that organizations like the John Locke Foundation has been talking about for a long time that will, have a real economic benefit and just a more positive outcome for a lot of the citizens of North Carolina. So, I'm optimistic and hopeful. I think there's a real appetite to get some work done to help the people who have suffered under COVID. So I wanted to start there by saying that. But with that said, I do think that regulatory and healthcare are two of the biggest issue areas where we could see a lot of reform. Starting with healthcare, obviously, the pandemic, it had one of the biggest effects on our healthcare system here in North Carolina and around the country. So we're going to be, reeling from that from a long time, from these, these healthcare facilities that have been, put to the stress test for a long time as we've dealt with this pandemic. So I think, when we think about how we can come out of COVID and have a more, functional healthcare market, I think one of the things is going to be increasing the supply of healthcare around the state. And, what I mean by that is, we have plenty of demand. We know that, residents around the state, they have medical issues and they need treatment. And so, especially with such a rural population and a very, maldistribution of supply in the state that, I think we can start to, work on. And that includes increasing the number of healthcare facilities. And we can do that through, certificate of need reform by allowing more professionals to set up shop in different areas of the state without getting permission from the government. We can, look at occupational licensing reform and as well as scope of practice reform. And this deals with the medical professionals and where they can practice and, getting a lot of other out-of-state providers to treat North Carolina patients. Again, just going back to increasing the supply. And then we know we have coverage issues in North Carolina. Not everybody has the adequate health insurance that they would like. And we have some real cost problems there. So, we can look to reforms like the ones that I just talked about that can help drive down the cost of insurance. We can also look to alternative insurance models such as association health plans, short-term limited duration insurance to make sure that everyone has the options or everyone has access to the options that would best suit their needs. And then, we just have an overarching, just high cost problem in healthcare. So we're hoping a lot of these reforms will really drive down the cost of healthcare, extend access to folks that, live in medically underserved areas and just create a more functional healthcare market as we, reel from the pandemic. And then on the regulatory side, we know that tons of people have lost work. They're out of the job. So what we can do right now is help these workers by rolling back regulations that would hinder someone from entering the job market, such as looking at, occupational licensing reform, making sure that, folks don't have any impediments to using their skills that they're well trained for to get into the job market. We should also look at the threat of unions and how we can ensure that workers have as much freedom to, associate with which groups they want and ensure that that's not an impediment on their work and their freedom to work too. So like I said, I think this all goes hand in hand when we think about the pandemic and the effect on North Carolinians. So as we look to how can we bounce back, I think, looking at how we can reform healthcare and the regulatory sector to ensure that folks can work and then folks, all their money they earn isn't being eaten up by high healthcare costs. So those two are going to go hand in hand. And I think they have a lot to do with the economic growth that we want to see in the state as we bounce back from this pandemic. So again, very optimistic and hopeful. And I hope that, we can get some real work done with the General Assembly this year.
Everything that you've just laid out, Jordan, it's really fascinating listening to you talk, because the sad irony is that COVID-19, this pandemic, has really hyper-focused the importance of these very issues that you're talking about, and the incredible need for additional practitioners to come into the state to make it easier for them to be licensed to work here, to provide the care that we know we need. And then when it comes to earning a living, just so many people who have suddenly been put in a position where they don't have a paycheck. So how do we make it easier and come out of this whole thing really rebounding like we want Carolina to be able to do? Hopefully soon, fingers crossed, if the vaccination process speeds up and we can get through this, that will happen. Leah, You are covering an area, Leah, that has to do with education and the budget. And boy, COVID-19 has really impacted the issues that you're going to be working on with legislators, helping to inform them about certain things. Education in particular, parents, they're having to become educators themselves. Kids are struggling in many cases to adapt to this new learning environment. What are you going to be focusing on, Leah, when it comes to education?
Yeah, so first let me echo Jordan's sentiments that I am optimistic about this session as well. And I'll also just say that I'm thrilled to be a part of the Locke team coming over from Civitas formerly. So I'm glad to be with you guys. We're working all towards the same mission anyway. And I think this makes a lot of sense and we're all excited going forward. So I'm grateful and honored to be part of this team. I want to circle back to your question on education, but first I'd like to just give our viewers some demographics of the General Assembly, if that's okay. So in the State House, as Becki mentioned, there are 120 members, and after this year's election, there are 69 Republicans and 51 Democrats. In the State Senate, there are 50 senators with 28 Republicans and 22 Democrats. And I'm happy to get into a breakdown of who's new, how many new people we have. We can circle back to that if you guys want to later. But I just did want to throw out the partisan makeup just for people who are curious about how this election went and who's going to be in power and leadership. And as Becki mentioned, this is going to affect who the leaders of each chamber are most likely going forward. And so, yeah, to circle back to education, like Jordan, I'm optimistic that COVID-19 has opened a door to a lot of policymakers and a lot of people in the public to see the benefits of some things that, maybe we at the Locke Foundation have been advocating for a while. And as Becki mentioned, part of that includes putting more control of their children's education into the hands of parents versus funding systems that don't always meet the needs of each individual child. And we know, online learning has been something that traditional public schools have undertaken as well as alternative schools have undertaken. And we've seen how, each child, even as they're doing online learning, may, move at a different pace with different subjects and whatnot. And so I think it's really opened the door for some opportunities to look at things like competency-based learning, which we may see from the new superintendent of public instruction after this election. It's kind of part of her background. And so I'll be curious to see if that's something that permeates into this conversation as maybe it should have before, but now the opportunity is open. I say, let's take it. And then when it comes to the budget this year, it's a little bit different than some of the other areas in that I think the budget is going to be as kind of a question mark right now. We don't know what the impacts on the state economy are going to be. So we don't know about those revenue. How much money is the state going to have coming in? What are we going to need to spend the money on? But I think the uncertainty around this does highlight an opportunity. So for the past, 5 or 6 years, we've had a positive economic situation in North Carolina. We've had positive revenues. And part of that has been solid leadership from the General Assembly in controlling their spending. But that being said, it was a leadership choice. It wasn't something that they had to do by the state constitution. All they have to do according to the state constitution is balance the budget. So don't spend more than you take in. But the spending limits that the General Assembly has imposed on itself in past years, we think those are great. We'd like to see some security going forward that future General Assemblies won't have to rely on, is leadership going to rise to that challenge or not? We want to see that really enshrined in our state constitution so that this just becomes normal going forward. And I think the question mark around COVID-19 provides a perfect example of why something like that would be so important. It's admirable to budget well during good times, but it's much more challenging to do it during bad times. And so something like a spending limit in our state constitution really could be a natural next step when things are so up in the air about how the state budget is going to go this year.
Becki, Leah brings up a really key point, and that is to continue along this same fiscal path, because North Carolina has been in such a better financial position than many other states to weather COVID-19 and to look to the future and have COVID hurt us fiscally, but not really put us into a dire situation. Now, in the 2020 election, Becki, we know that North Carolina voters overwhelmingly sent back to the legislature many of those lawmakers who endorse those fiscally conservative policies, who are part of that legacy that Leah referred to. So in some ways, folks with the mindset that is really good for North Carolina's future have been returned. So hopefully they will be much more open and continue to be open to these ideas.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping to. And Leah gave a brief update on the numbers in the General Assembly, Republicans and Democrats. Another point just to add on to that is that although many pundits, many political consultants were saying before the election that the Republicans would lose the majority in either or both of the houses or lose a lot of seats. Actually, in the House, they picked up 4 additional seats, and in the Senate, they only lost 1 net seat. And Donna, you've heard me say this, in analyzing those election results, what that told me was that there is an appetite among North Carolina voters for restrained spending, fewer regulations, many of the things that we talk about at the John Locke Foundation. So yeah, as far as budgeting, I mean, North Carolina, the provisions that have been put in place over the last decade have put North Carolina on fiscally sound ground. And when you are gobsmacked with something like a global pandemic, that's when it really shows up. And so although we've got to be very careful and we've got to be very thoughtful and we've got to be very restrained, we do have money in our savings accounts. We do have money in reserves so that we can meet some of the needs that we're going to see coming out of this pandemic without devastating the economy. And probably even more importantly, it puts us in a position for a quicker and stronger recovery. So many of these decisions that the legislators are going to be making, whether it's some of the regulations and the healthcare decisions, as Jordan mentioned, or some of the very important education provisions that we're going to need moving out of it, to me, it kind of comes down to a question of there's clearly a role for government in this recovery. What we believe at the Locke Foundation and what we are advocating for with lawmakers is a mindset of let's identify where the real needs are and let's help those people that need it get back on their feet so that they can, again, provide for themselves and their families in a way that they choose rather than being dependent on government. What we're seeing from the left and kind of the other way of thinking about things are there are tremendous needs that North Carolinians are going to have that have and are going to continue to have coming out of this pandemic, and a notion that government needs to have longstanding programs to fill all of those needs. And in my view, that hampers people from being able to recover. It holds people back from the freedoms and the opportunity and the liberty that they want. So it's a real different mindset going into this session. Don, I will share with you and our viewers today that one of the questions that I have asked over the years when I'm looking at a piece of legislation, you know, everything is not black and white. Many of these things are nuanced, and there are arguments to be made on both sides of, you know, what is the appropriate role of government. And a question that I always ask myself when I'm analyzing that and consulting with our colleagues at the Locke Foundation is, does this provision enhance freedom? Does this mean that someone is more free with this, or does it take someone's freedom away? So it's that freedom question that you ask over many of these are very complicated policy issues. So whether it's healthcare, whether it's regulations, whether it's the environment, whether it's energy, whether it's budget, whether it's education, that's one question that we always ask is, does this enhance someone's freedom? And we will always come down on the side of freedom.
And that whole balance, and where is the line, and how do you have that role for government when it's needed, but how do you let the private sector handle areas that in many cases the private sector can handle in a better way? Broadband, for example, I think is a really interesting situation. Mm-hmm. We know that people need access to broadband to be able to operate in a global market economy. But there's a question about how do we deliver it? How do we provide that access?
And that's one of the things the General Assembly is absolutely going to be talking about. When I talk to legislators, and Leah and Jordan and I are meeting with legislators every day, having conversations, and we ask them, what is the biggest challenge in your district? And 9 times out of 10, the top 3 challenges, in the top 3 challenges is broadband. And, you know, we are as we address the challenges of COVID, and as we put provisions and policies in place to come out of this, there are some things that we have learned that I think are going to escalate and make these policies more relevant and come on board quicker than maybe if we had not gone through this. And I think this whole notion of access to broadband is one of those. And we see this, and Jordan can talk about this more than I can, but this reliance and this realization that telehealth and being able to correspond with your doctor for some of your medical needs, now not everything, I mean, obviously it's going to be a little hard to do heart surgery, over the computer, but for a lot of medical questions, those can be addressed with telehealth. They save money, and more importantly, they save time, for you and your physician. That has worked very well. But you got to have access to broadband in order to take advantage of this. Leah talked a little bit about the challenges with online learning. That is difficult enough for kids to stay on task, for them to stay in front of a computer screen for 6 hours a day and to keep on schedule. That's hard enough. But for many of our students across North Carolina, there's also a real challenge with the access to the broadband, with even being able to get onto that Zoom call with their teacher and their classmates. So, and we see it in every aspect. If we're going to attract businesses here to North Carolina, if our businesses are going to be able to grow, if, as Jordan has advocated, if we remove some of the regulations so that businesses, we have a more friendly environment for businesses, we're going to have access to broadband. And what we are seeing is that government does not innovate and provide technology in a particularly efficient, effective way. And just 3 examples are, this vaccine rollout. The government is not, the government is not a good entity to do that. If you look at, getting unemployment checks delivered to people, if you look at getting the COVID money out and into people's pockets, the government is very clumsy and burdensome to do that. When you're talking about a service like broadband and government's clumsiness in doing any of those kind of programs, and then you throw into it the fast-paced changes in technology, you've got a very inefficient, ineffective method of increasing that access to broadband. So again, there's a function for government to speed this up and to make sure that we get this access across North Carolina. But the best place for technology, innovation, changes is clearly in the private market. And Leah has been doing some national has been working with some national groups on broadband access. And Leah, you may want to add something to that.
I think everything you said was a great point. I'll just echo what you said about the innovation, piece. We don't want to, in North Carolina, spend a lot of taxpayer money on technology that is going to be outdated within just a couple of years, and better things have come along. And then we have this clunky system that we've spent a lot of money on. For those of you who can guess based on my voice that I'm from rural North Carolina, I certainly don't want to see anyone in North Carolina left behind. And I know that even back in my hometown, there are struggles with that. So I feel this pain, I think North Carolina in particular, because we do have such a large, just rural land mass in the state. And we're going to face these problems when it comes to, the private market. It's really expensive to go that extra mile. And so when it comes to what the state can do to help people get connectivity, be that broadband or some other form, it could be, we do have a grant program for broadband here. It could be adding some guardrails to that, or even expanding it to other technologies. It could be some kind of direct to consumer, voucher idea of, we're not going to invest in the technology, but we're going to help people supplement the cost if they're too far away. Something like that could be an option. And then I think just the other part of it is, staying out of the way, resisting the urge to get involved, as we've seen in other states or cities around the nation where it's been a disaster, where government has tried to actually be the provider of connectivity, and that has gone poorly, or they've tried to over-regulate things to get things a certain way, manipulate the market. And again, it's just not, as Becki said, government is not good at that. We know that. So just resisting the urge to do the wrong thing, and then pitching in where we can, and relying on our private sector, partners to get connectivity to North Carolinians.
And I would just add to that too, again, data and facts are very important as you're making any of these kinds of decisions, particularly when you're talking about people's lives and you're talking about people's money. And, one of the other challenges in the broadband is having the accurate data as to who exactly has what kind of broadband service. And I know there's been a lot of controversy about those reports that are done, and some of them are done by the FCA and other things. But, just because you have broadband connection may not mean that you have the broadband connection that fills the need for a particular business or a certain educational challenge or even the telehealth. So, that's the other thing that has to be a piece of this is as we make those decisions, we have to have the most accurate data available as well.
Jordan, I kind of wonder if medical professionals won't be on the front lines now, no pun intended, be on the front lines of trying to join with organizations such as the Locke Foundation to talk about the access to broadband question. We have read stories, we have seen stories about what's happening with mental health as we all try to live our lives through COVID-19. And that connection to a doctor, particularly someone who can help you talk through things, work through difficult situations, has become really important. And telehealth is a really good opportunity for that if you have the access to it. What do you find as you look through the research and talk to your the folks that you know in the healthcare industry?
Yeah, so I mean, we recently partnered with the Brookings Institute in DC to write a big kind of national analysis of where telehealth regulations are. And, as we've given these presentations and talked to the stakeholders after our paper was released, I mean, everything comes after broadband. I mean, broadband is so crucial to this because, the telehealth technology is only good as one's ability to connect to it. So if we talk about, these problems in rural healthcare, these medical deserts where folks have not had, the latest technology, they don't have access to the best specialists, things like this, without broadband connectivity, then telehealth just cannot function like this. So what we've seen is that, yes, there's certainly rural groups partnering with, the medical professionals in the area to set up or to try to create these not back channels, but these methods of connecting with other providers, whether that be emergency rooms or specialists from across the country. And so that's another reason why we need to look at these telehealth regulations that may limit one's ability in North Carolina to connect to providers from out of state, for example, just making sure that there's as much. In the United States, it's always been curious to me, but we set up 50 little hubs of medical care in the 50 states. And so, one of telehealth's greatest benefits is that we can connect over a long distance from the patient to the provider. So we shouldn't limit that just to the state. We know that there's, plenty of healthcare providers out there, but it's just not distributed correctly. So as telehealth becomes more incorporated into these traditional models of care, we know that, ensuring that the professionals and the patient having free and full access to choose how they get that care is going to be so important. And, it's been sort of a silver lining in this pandemic that we've seen, this natural experiment of incorporating telehealth. And what we find is that a lot of patients prefer to use telehealth to connect in the privacy of their own home per se. And also medical professionals have been able to see a lot more patients as, the visits are streamlined, there's no waiting, and it's just it's a huge savior of time. So, it's folks are getting more comfortable with it. It's becoming more and more common. Insurers are covering a lot of different or a lot more different types of telehealth. So it's going to become more common. And so we should, make sure that government's out of the way as we, continue to incorporate this. And like I said at the beginning of this is that, everything that comes with telehealth, broadband has to come before that. So they go hand in hand. And I just think it's going to be more and more common for medical practices and patients to use telehealth just to streamline and reduce any inefficiencies in how we utilize our healthcare infrastructure. So that's a paramount point as we move forward into the session.
Are there barriers, Jordan, to those medical professionals who do want to practice in North Carolina, but maybe they are licensed in a particular specialty in another state? They'd love to be able to come here, set up shop, help people, particularly in those areas of the state where we know there is a, as you put it, maldistribution. There's just a dearth of doctors or easy access to a medical facility. What can North Carolina do? What are you going to be talking to lawmakers about to try to knock down some of those barriers so that we still have a reasonable regulatory network in place where you can ensure that people are qualified, providing the standard of care, but as easy as possible for them to come into our state?
Right. And so that's exactly what we're looking at here is how can we make sure that it's the most streamlined process for licensed medical professionals in other states who wish to treat North Carolina patients who are currently in North Carolina have the easiest way to do that. And right now, if let's say you're a doctor in Virginia, you're licensed in Virginia, you're in good standing with the Virginia Medical Board, you would have to reapply with the North Carolina Medical Board to get a license to practice in the state. Now, what do we know, especially those demonstrated during the COVID-19 pandemic, is medical professionals don't lose their skills as they cross over a state line or see a patient virtually. So, we should, emphasize that these are medical professionals that are in good standing, that they should be able to treat North Carolina patients. And so one way we can do that is to, it's called different things. And what I would like to see is, a universal recognition system, or at least in telehealth, to where if you're in good standing in Virginia, you can quickly apply to the North Carolina board to say, I am in good standing. I've been practicing. I have all the proper licenses. I would like to treat patients in North Carolina. And instead of going through the long and burdensome process of getting relicensed, holding 2 medical licenses, you can just say, I'm in Virginia, I have my license, and I'd like to practice here now. And the North Carolina board would approve of you. And that would, again, as we talked about at the beginning, just increase the supply. It would increase competition among providers. Patients would have many more choices. And, we wouldn't be limited to just seeing the doctors that are licensed in our state, when you may prefer to see someone who's, at the top of their field in some specialty, but they live in another state. So it's just going to streamline the process. It makes patients have more options, and it's another low cost option, because at the end of the day, the biggest thing that we want to look at is just getting folks access to medical care. Telehealth is one way to do that. So we should knock down these barriers.
It's common sense, really. What you're describing is really practical. So hopefully there's some bipartisan support for doing that in the General Assembly. We are getting questions. Becki, Jordan, and Leah, we've had several people who have sent in questions for you. Becki, I'd like to go to this one from Martha, because Martha touches on something you mentioned early on in our forum today, and that has to do with the emergency powers that we have seen Governor Roy Cooper use quite robustly during COVID-19. Martha writes this: without a veto-proof majority in either house, what can the legislature do to curb Governor Cooper's, as she puts it, abuse of the emergency powers statute?
Well, Martha, thank you. That's a great question. And here's what I would pose to lawmakers who are considering this. Don't think it in terms of Governor Cooper's authority. Think of it in terms of the governor of the state of North Carolina. So if you take the personalities out of it, and, to the extent that you can, remove your partisan hat from the discussion, what do you, as a North Carolina citizen, want your elected officials to be able to do in case of an emergency? And I think that, from my viewpoint, most of us, if North Carolina's coast is hit by a hurricane, or if there's flooding in certain parts of North Carolina, or if there's a fire or mudslides in the western part of the state, there's an emergency. We want somebody to be able to step up and put some of those emergency measures in place, whether it is, just for example, one of the things the governor is allowed to do is to waive the weight of trucks on certain roads roads. And the reason for that is so that you can get supplies to people that need them, quickly. That's just one example of those kind of things. So I think that as the way the Emergency Management Act is written, most of us would not object to the governor, one person. You got to pick somebody, it makes sense that it would be the governor, to make those decisions on a quick and immediate effort that people need. People are being flooded out of their homes tonight. We've got to get them help. That is reasonable. That is common sense. What I don't think makes sense to anyone is that one person should be given the authority to make those kind of decisions for months and months and months on end, as Governor Cooper has done. Now, what has been proposed, there was a bill that went through the General Assembly last session and passed both the House and the Senate, went to the governor's office and he vetoed it. But it would have been things like after 30 days, the governor would then have to confer and get the approval of the Council of State. I would also, Council of State, keep this in mind, regardless of what political party those people may be a part of, these are other statewide elected officials that the people of North Carolina elected. They should be your sounding board. They should be, the stopgap. That should be who the governor should be going to, hey, what do you think? And be able to ask the Commissioner of Agriculture, how is this affecting the agriculture business? What do we need to do as an emergency message to help the agriculture industry? To be able to go to the superintendent of public instruction and say, what are the emergency things we need to be doing to help our school children? For the Department of Labor, the insurance commissioner, all of these should have a voice in that. And they have not. The governor has chosen not to do that. Further, I would advocate that at some point, the General Assembly needs to weigh on this as well. These are the elected representatives of the people across North Carolina. They were elected to make these kinds of decisions. And, they can be called in, they can come back to Raleigh pretty quickly. What we've learned through this pandemic is they can also do a lot over Zoom, like we're doing today. So there are options here. So and Martha has a really good question, because I think when this was posed last year, we were in the middle of the heat of this. And the main advocate for reining this in was the lieutenant governor, who, as sitting on the council members, Council of State, I think he absolutely was in his purview to say, hey, what about us? Ask us. Unfortunately, the lieutenant governor was running against the governor to be the next governor of North Carolina. So it quickly became political. I don't see this as a political question. I see this as a good government, transparency, efficient, effective way that we want our government to run. So what my plea to lawmakers would be, don't think of this in terms of doing something to Governor Cooper. Think of this in terms of what do we want the office of governor to be able to do, and how are we going to position ourselves to react when there is an emergency that lasts more than just a couple of days.
Yeah, it's an issue of precedent as well. Let's say that 4 years, 8 years, 12 years down the road, governor, no matter who it is, decides that something
Governor
else,
Dan Forrest.
Right, decides that something else is of such a threat or critical nature to North Carolina that he or she would decide, okay, I have a precedent of Roy Cooper back in 2020 using this act in a very muscular fashion, so I'm going to do that as well and apply it to XYZ issue. Well, it could be that the people who now think that Governor Cooper is using the power appropriately would be vehemently opposed to what the future governor wanted to work on. So it's an issue of the future, not just the present, it seems to me.
Absolutely. And, I would say to those folks too, this is an insurance policy for no matter which side of the political spectrum you may sit on. This is an insurance policy that the other guy won't be able to, there's not an opportunity for the other guy to abuse that authority and that power. So I think that now is the time to do it. And you could certainly phrase this in such a way that, beginning at a date forward that this is the way that it would be. Or I don't know, the other thing is, I've always wondered why Governor Cooper would object to having the council of the duly elected statewide officials that sit on the Council of State, why he would object to them weighing in on their particular area of expertise and advising him in order to make the best decisions for all of North Carolina. These people were elected too.
And, Leah, speaking of the future and COVID-19, and we've seen Governor Cooper use the Emergency Powers Act, we have seen parents, Leah, all of a sudden being put in the position of being the teacher for their child or their children. And in an odd way, it has really focused parents, I think, on so much about their children. They've learned so much, their aptitudes, their challenges, how they interact with other kids. And it has opened a lot of parents' eyes to the fact that one-size education does not fit all. What do you think, Leah, about the issue of school choice in North Carolina and how this might play out in the legislature now that we have seen 9 months, 10 months of education, online learning, working for some kids, not working for a lot of other kids? Is this the tipping point where North Carolina really says, yes, every parent should be able to choose? They know their child best, they know what works and what doesn't work, and oddly enough, COVID-19 is what has really illustrated it to a lot of parents.
Yeah, I think you've articulated that very well. It's exactly what is going to happen, I think, with COVID-19. So school choice can kind of be a little bit of a buzzword, but basically what we're saying there is, you have traditional public schools that are funded on a per pupil basis. And they're operated, by the state of North Carolina and by local districts. And then you have schools outside of that. So an example is public charter schools, which are publicly funded and operated, but outside of local districts. You have private schools. You have, a variety of other online schools. And other things. And North Carolina has certain school choice programs that current populations in North Carolina can apply for, such as low-income children or children with disabilities, that can either be a scholarship to attend a private school that would be publicly funded, the scholarship money would be, or what's called an education savings account for students with disabilities, which allows parents to spend that money on not just tuition, but other educational materials that they might need, especially with their disability. So these programs already exist in North Carolina, where we're starting to not think about, taxpayer money going to a school for a student, but instead taxpayer money going to a family for a student. And it seems like a subtle shift, but it really has a big impact because, as you said, every child is different. Every child may need different things. And so one thing that we would like to see that I think conceptually makes a lot of sense when, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, is funding known as backpack funding, which would basically be like each kid takes their funding with them wherever they go as if they're wearing it in a backpack. And so, if they go to a private school and their tuition isn't all of the money that they have, they could spend that on educational materials. And obviously there would need to be constraints on that. You don't want, people being able to spend money on whatever they want. Has to be for the child's education. But I think just that shift in mindset of families taking ownership of their child's education and being able to make those decisions based on each child's individual needs. Like I said, North Carolina has some of these programs, and the General Assembly can choose to go the more incremental route this time around, expanding eligibility, increasing the amount of money that those programs offer. And I think any of those we would be happy to see. Let's expand choice in any way that we can. But at the end of the day, the long-term goal and vision for education in North Carolina really could be up in the air because of COVID. And I say, let's take this opportunity to improve it if we can.
We're getting some more comments on Facebook in reaction to our discussion today. And let me read this one from Mick. Mick writes this in the comment section of the Facebook page. What about a legislative action to accept reciprocal license between states that don't require each provider to apply, but automatically recognizes a license? This could work for health care, but also things like electricians, plumbers, etc., so they can cross borders locally. So Mick obviously is a thinker in terms of freedom and easy access and helping people earn a living. So Jordan, I think he's on your team.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's got a great idea there. And, I would point, the viewers today and North Carolina legislators to check out Arizona's law. They just put in, a universal recognition law, which is a little bit different than reciprocal. It can mean different things in different states. But essentially what Arizona did is what we talked about before. And what Mick is discussing is that if you have that license, you just have to take it and apply in North Carolina. Now, a reciprocal license, from what I've seen in other states and from what I've seen discussed, could go a little bit further, and it just it's basically automatically granted. And so I think some people have some hesitation about that. But in terms of just universal licensure recognition, I think absolutely that is the right way to go for North Carolina, so that, it's not just healthcare professionals, which, would be key during this time, but it's all different types of professionals that need an occupational license. And, we would even argue too that a lot of the occupational licenses are unnecessary because they don't add, any public safety measures or anything like that. They're, just more essentially crony boards set up to extract money from these individuals, and that hurts workers and hurts consumers. But I think absolutely, we need to look at across the board, how can we make North Carolina one of the best states to work in, and attract as many new people. We know that there's tons of people moving down to North Carolina from all over in the north and the west. So we need to ensure that they can take their skills, come into North Carolina, get to work right away without too much burden on them. And again, it just puts us as a leader, especially in the Southeast, accepting all these licenses and ensuring that, with proper consumer protections in place, but, not hindering what these highly trained workers can do. And that starts with that universal licensure recognition system.
I think about what a blessing that could be to the family members of military men and women. We have so many folks who are stationed here in North Carolina, and they may have moved from somewhere else, and they have a family member who's trying to find a job and is unfortunately getting up against fees and licenses and testing, et cetera, when they have been working in a field in another state. That could be a real blessing for them.
It would be a blessing. And it also is a great way to get great workers in North Carolina, whether it's
Exactly.
teachers, whether it's school counselors. I mean, as Jordan mentioned, and Mick alluded to as well, it doesn't have to be just healthcare workers. It can be anything. And, I would argue, Donna, you're exactly right. And, our military spouses are a huge workforce. But, how disappointing and how frustrating would that be that you're transferred here and your spouse is not able to get a job in what they have been trained to do. Now, of course, I would advocate that, we've got to have some safety measures in place. I mean, this would be somebody that perhaps was licensed in their state for, you pick the time frame, but, a year or 2 years, and didn't have any actions against them or anything like that. I mean, we want to put some guardrails in, of course, but, our military families, and then also as we're trying to attract businesses to North Carolina, more headquarters, more, not just businesses to expand in North Carolina, but businesses moving to North Carolina. That should be another tool in our toolbox, rather than all these crazy incentive giveaway programs, to have a reciprocity kind of program in place, so that as business executives and workers in other businesses are thinking of transferring to North Carolina, aside from a great education system, aside from great health care, being able to continue your occupation that you have been trained in has to be another great key to use that way. So that this reciprocity thing, it just seems like somewhat of a no-brainer. And I would even take that a step further and say, that we should look at reciprocity here across state lines, but also in different parts of the country as we become more of a global community, particularly in the area we live and work in around Research Triangle Park. Some highly trained individuals who hold licensing or hold credentials from another country, that's another area that I think we should look at.
Now, we are getting even more questions and comments, which is great. We love to do this. So I'd like to try to get a couple in here before we end our time today. All right, Jordan, this one is for you. This is from Ken. Ken writes, what alternative health care could be offered to replace or compete with Obamacare?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I think what we've seen is that congressional Republicans missed their opportunity to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. I don't think any of the Supreme Court cases are going to result in overturning of the law. So unfortunately, it looks like the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land. So what we can do in North Carolina is, implement reforms that bolster and strengthen our individual markets. So for those who don't get their insurance from work, they can, have a robust set of options at affordable rates to, purchase on the Affordable Care Act exchanges. We can, do a lot of those reforms that we talked about at the beginning, some of the supply side reforms to put downward pressure on prices. And hopefully, with a large package of these reforms, it can really drastically reduce the cost of insurance, the out-of-pocket costs to individuals. We can also look for opportunities like association health plans that would compete with Obamacare plans. And these are for the small businesses and individuals that have been priced out of the Affordable Care Act market. They can't afford the cost of insurance from the products currently offered. And so association health plans give those businesses other opportunities to band together. But, I think another thing too is that we need to promote and emphasize the fact that a lot of the employers in North Carolina, they have a lot of options that they may not know right now, including some self-funding options where they can set up their own health insurance plans, contract directly with providers to get a robust set of benefits without, paying full premiums on, a fully insured plan that you buy in the market. So I think we need to, one, strengthen the individual market. So folks who don't get insurance from work have a lot of options. We need to strengthen and bolster these alternative options, such as association health plans and short-term limited duration insurance. And then we also need to work with our business community, the folks that are trying to either offer health insurance or are struggling to afford it, to make sure that they have more sustainable and affordable plans, because there are options out there that exist. So that's how we can compete with and unfortunately now strengthen the Affordable Care Act to make sure it works for as many people as possible.
And Becki, I'd like to try to get this question into you for a quick reply. It's an involved question, but Mark writes, what legislative changes can we expect to ensure free and fair elections in the future here in North Carolina? Boy, I know that there's a lot that goes into that, but is there kind of a Reader's Digest answer that you might have for Mark on that?
Donna, I think based on the past election that we just had and the control and the power that the State Board of Elections assumed for themselves, Mark Elias coming in here and making a settlement outside of the General Assembly, I think that we could very well see some strengthening and clarification of where the responsibility for election lies, and that is with the General Assembly. I think that we're also going to see some looking at some the mail-in ballots, things like the 2-witness signature, should the ballots be notarized? I don't think the voter ID question has really been answered. I don't think that's over. So I think absolutely we're going to see some election reform provisions that are going to be discussed. I think you can look for that. When that is, I'm not sure, but Andy Jackson, who is with Locke, is our election expert, and you can be looking to him over the next several months for some ideas, for some analysis and some updates on what's going on. That is on our key issue of, and we're really talking about, Donna, election integrity is what matters to us, and how can we ensure that here in North Carolina, our elections are that folks can depend on them to be full of integrity and trust and feel confident as they go to vote. And so those are the things that we're going to be looking for at the Locke Foundation moving forward. But yes, I think the General Assembly will look at that. We'll be watching. And of course, we'll be making our list of suggestions of where those measures may be able to be changed to, again, ensure the integrity in our election system.
So on Wednesday, the General Assembly comes back into session, and Becki, as you mentioned, they'll do some committees and make a few votes on committees and leadership, et cetera. And then really January 27th is the big day when they will come back in and get to work in earnest. Now, of course, Carolina Journal is going to be reporting on all of this, folks. You have to be checking in at carolinajournal.com at least once a day. Try it twice or 3 times during the session. There's constant updates to activity Also, johnlocke.org, the research team here. And remember, this is an expanded Locke Foundation research team now that the Civitas Institute and the John Locke Foundation have joined forces. We've merged our capabilities. We are all now under the Locke Foundation. It is an incredible opportunity. We are so excited about all of this. One team, one fight, one voice for freedom. You're going to find it at johnlocke.org as well. Now, for the three government affairs folks that we've been talking with today, led by Becki Gray, you all are on Twitter. And I know you are tweeting constantly about what's going on every day, but particularly during this session. If you'll give everybody your Twitter feed, how to reach you, that would be great.
I'm at Becki Gray. It's BECKIGRAY. And let me just assure everyone that if you believe in freedom, if you believe in liberty, if you believe in personal responsibility, you can count and trust Jordan, Leah, and myself to represent your interest at the General Assembly. We are going to be down there. We are already down there. We are going to, as soon as we leave here, we are headed down to the General Assembly to meet with legislators. You can trust us to represent and to ensure that your voice is heard. And we do it through Twitter. We do it through locker room posts. We confer with the researchers, with the Carolina Journal staff. We are one team here at the Locke Foundation, and you can trust and count on us. And we are delighted and humbled to have the responsibility that we have in this new organization.
Okay, so we've got at John Locke NC, at Carolina Journal, at Becki Gray, and then Jordan and Leah, how can folks find you?
You can find me at Jordan Roberts NC, like North Carolina, on Twitter.
Leah?
Yeah, and I'm just at Leah Byers, and I think I speak for all three of us when I say, come for the political content and stay for the dog pictures. So you might find those from all three of us occasionally.
And recipes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There you go. And see, it's such a well-rounded team, as you can tell.
We have
from
fun.
this. Leah Byers, Jordan Roberts, and Becki Gray, thanks so much for joining us today. And folks, thank you for joining us for our first Shaftesbury Society virtual forum in 2021. As you know, this is a place you can come every single Monday at noontime. We, without very many weeks off at all, we are always bringing you a really interesting, meaty discussion. That's what we want to do. We want to help you understand what the public policy choices are here in North Carolina, what the ramifications are if lawmakers choose one path versus another path. And of course, the path that we want for you, for your family, is to be as free as possible, to make those decisions on your own so that you can be prosperous, you can pass down wealth to your children and your grandchildren to lead a happy, fulfilling, productive life. That is what it's all about. It is the mission of the John Locke Foundation. If you believe in those things, we would ask you to support our work. And it's very simple, very quick. Just go to johnlocke.org. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you're going to find the Donate tab right there. Just hit that Donate tab. In less than 2 minutes, you can make a secure, tax-deductible financial contribution to the John Locke Foundation to help us fuel all of this work that we've been talking about today. We would be so appreciative of that. Couldn't thank you enough. So once you've done that, as I said, be sure to watch carolinajournal.com, get on Twitter, follow our folks, go to johnlocke.org. That General Assembly session starts on Wednesday. We will be there for you. We are your voice. And be sure to join us next Monday for another edition of Shaftesbury Society. Hope you have a great week. On behalf of the entire team, I'm Donna Martinez. We'll see you on Monday.